Good morning, everybody. It's good to have you all here. My name is Alex Len-Ferner, and I am a postdoctoral fellow at Nelson Mandela University, and supported by the National Institute for Humanities and Social Sciences, and affiliated to the Iscia chair. And it's very good to have you all here for another installment of our seminar series on Everything is Energy. And we are very fortunate to be joined today by Dr. Eddie Cottle. And Dr. Cottle is a postdoctoral fellow at the Southern Center for Inequality Studies at Wits University. He's a former trade unionist, which I affiliate and stand in solidarity with as a trade unionist of historic proportion myself, historically, and was the policy and campaign officer for Building and Woodworkers International in the Africa and Middle East region. He also served as head of collective bargaining support at the Labour Research Service in Cape Town. So it's a real pleasure to have you, Dr. Cottle. And the topic of your talk today is the myth of a green economy and green jobs. What strategy for labor? So really nice to be bringing that labor perspective into our seminar series. So thank you very much, Dr. Cottle. I'll hand over to you.
Okay, no, thank you so much for organizing this webinar. I wrote a paper on the same topic back in 2017. And I think at that stage, critiques on the kind of perspectives on the green economy were quite few, and I guess rare. And so I guess I never had much opportunity to present. So I'm very happy to have all of you here as an audience to share some of my views and to hear some of your critique on what I have to say. So I feel this is a great opportunity to kind of engage and take the issues of the labor movement much more seriously and put it in the center where I think it actually belongs. Now, I do have a PowerPoint presentation, but before I get there, I really was concerned with the kind of paradigm that was being, I think, put out by the UNEP, and of course the ITUC, which is the International Trade Union Confederation. Now, the concern was that there was a particular kind of belief that the source of the ecological and the jobs crisis was basically a lack of investment in the kinds of appropriate technologies that will be able to ensure that we sustain the environment and at the same time ensure that we sustain jobs and job creation. And part of the concern was that there was no kind of analysis of how such technological changes are located within the broader global economy itself, which is capitalism, and the nature of capital accumulation, and the nature of material production itself. So it was kind of a perspective, in my view, that created some kind of an abstraction from how actual processes of technology and production are tied together within a global system. The second, I think, concern was that there was a deep, I think, assumption that if you have a system which has a greater amount of technological efficiencies, and this one based on alternative technologies which are considered green, this would be automatically result in a green economy and what they call green jobs. And my critique here extends to the fact that there is, I think, a lack of understanding that capital accumulation since the Industrial Revolution has always gone green. And every great leap in technology, in some sense, has been greener than the past technologies. And I will come and explain some of those things. And I feel that without having some more kind of robust critique on this kind of paradigm, we would in fact be party to the kinds of deepening of not only wealth inequality, but also social and environmental inequalities around the globe. And I'm just briefly going to explain how I'm going to proceed. Is it possible for you to just, Alex, allow me to put my presentation up onto the screen? Oh, I can do that?
Andrea would have to help you there.
Okay, I have it. I got it.
Okay. Yeah, just get your presentation up and then press share screen at the bottom of the, there we go. Perfect. Now you just need to press, I think, slideshow.
There, is that clear?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, right. So in the order of presentation, I've divided up in kind of looking at how economic growth and green jobs is being elaborated within this paradigm that is green jobs and green economy. I'll then try and situate it, what I believe is a very important lens to understand how technological change fits into what is called the Jevons paradox. And that kind of helped me understand the kinds of contradictions when one moves over to more energy saving or kind of alternative technologies, and the kinds of contradictions that occur. And then just briefly talk about this issue of how capitalism has actually been somewhat, inverted commas, green along the way, its long path of development. But most importantly for me is drawing lessons from the Montreal Protocol, which was the first kind of sponsored UNEP multilateral agreement on how to protect the ozone layer, and then looked at how labor should possibly look at the just transition and its alternatives. Now, what runs central through the definitions of a green economy and green jobs is the issue of growth. And that is what is called the new engine of growth. And in no way are these two things, in fact, separated, but they seem to be a shared belief amongst the ITUC and the UNEP that you could embark on a greener path of development without being a drag on growth. Now, this is very interesting because although the language in the paradigm that's presented here seems to be consistent with the notions that were developed in 1972 with the limits to growth, in fact, it's a step back from the 1972 kind of ideas about growing the economy. And I think there was the alarm bell that there is a grave danger that the nature of growth of the world economy, regardless of its technology, but the mere fact that we're having this growing of expansion, dramatic expansion of the economies, is key kind of a problem that we should deal with. And I think here what we see is that it's not the center of the problem. It is a kind of magic formula that's been presented that we can have the greening of economies, and then that actually will not be in contradiction to either the demands of labor, capital. So essentially, I think that for me is what I understand of what is being said here. Now, what are the kinds of implications of these ideas? So in the UNEP document on the green economy, it argues that the main problem of governments across the world is that they have merely invested their resources in the wrong areas. You know, they're investing in coal and this and that and other kinds of technologies, but instead the main focus should be, or the main flaw of government and public policy was that it didn't invest enough in renewable energy, and that is the source of the problem. And they called this the gross misallocation of capital in the text. So what is the solution? They're saying better policies, pricing, and regulation of how these funds are spent, and also, of course, how these kinds of economic activity and technological use is regulated. And And the main responsibility of the state is to ensure there is green investment and greening public procurement. The ITUC says something very, very similar. They say, you have to orientate financing towards investments, greening the economy, and thereby creating green jobs. So this is essentially what I'm saying is that you can see even here, there's no relationship between these policy proposals and how actually capital accumulation happens, and how you're going to deal with this impulse for growth under capital accumulation. So taking what they have argued currently, I'd like to locate this now in understanding technology and green technology within Javon's paradox. Now, Javon was really a British engineer, and basically Javon was requested by the government at the time to look at two things: the problem of the impact of coal on the health of the population, and then secondly, the problem of the rate of consumption of the coal, because there was a fear that they would run out of coal in the near future. And Javon, the conclusion of Javon's research was, he argued, was that it is wholly a confusion of ideas to suppose that the economical use of a fuel is equivalent to its diminished consumption. The very contrary is the truth. At the very economy of its use leads to its extensive consumption. It has been so in the past and will be so in the future. What he's basically trying to show was that his study of how coal was consumed and the improvements of the different locomotives, which allowed for the lowering of the unit of consumption of coal to ensure that the locomotive would kind of ride a particular distance. In other words, fewer units of coal were being used to go greater distances than before, and that way they started to save on the amount of coal being used within the economy at the time. But with each technological advance within the types of engine that was used in, it actually led to an increased consumption of that coal because of the unit cost dropping because of more efficient technology. This allowed for its expanded use within the economy at the time, because now it was cheaper actually to expand production, and this fueled basically the Industrial Revolution and the whole revolution on steel, which was central to that kind of revolution. And I want to argue that this paradox is still with us today, and is prevalent within the current types of technologies that are being proposed or actually being rolled out already in the global economy. Interesting enough, we recall here that one of the first things was that in the 1980s, there were studies done on the USA consumption of fuel, and this just kind of demonstrates Javon's paradox. The argument was that if we use and have cars that consume lower fuel consumption, or have lower fuel consumption, those would amount to the savings of how much of this fuel is then being used. But the study showed that although there was a 30% saving with the vehicles that have lower consumption, that did not change the overall aggregate consumption of those fuels, because the vehicles then that had the lower fuel consumption would then consume more in the longer term, and it would use those vehicles more often than they would have had the older type vehicles, which were more expensive to run. Secondly, we had, for example, the revolution on computers, and there it was, I think the big idea was that we will now enter a phase of capital accumulation, which would be kind of the wasteless kind of period where there would just be a dramatic decline of waste within the world, because now everything is done through computers. But the nations reports, of course, for Austria, Germany, Netherlands, United States showed that the efficiency and new management styles and practices have been offset by increases in scale of economic growth. In other words, these technologies which will come in, which are more efficient than past technologies, which allow for smaller unit consumption of energy, but that lowering of that energy for the use of commodity production actually allows it to be cheaper, and once it becomes cheaper, it allows for expand production and consumption of those commodities in line, I think, consistent with Javon's paradox. Now, looking into the current phase here, I think the big talk, of course, is windmills and solar panels and so on, which I think is more the kind of popular discourse or the more favorite kinds of technology, alternative technologies that are required. But if we take kind of the full value chain of how these kinds of new commodities, and that's what we should call them, they are commodities, right? They are being exchanged on the global market, you have to buy, and they are being sold at certain prices, and often they are monopoly prices. And so, but the value chain is still very, very, and it's in fact deeply committed to fossil fuels. And of course, it's reliant on, very reliant on extractivism. And we can see that even for almost all the components, for example, here of the windmill, which is identified in numbers, you know, all those components rely on heavy industrial machinery, heavy mining, and a whole chain process for that. And if we think that we're going to roll out windmills everywhere, that will offset, automatically start to offset carbon emissions, I think we're heading for a serious problem when we view that. And I think the same with solar panels and the kinds of chemicals or rare earth minerals that we need there for our cell phones, our laptops, and all these modern technologies which we are utilizing at the moment. They are all heavily reliant on the extractive industry. So the fact that we are talking now about a green model, I think then it has to be consistent with the nature of how those green things or green commodities are then being produced. And they're not being produced outside the current kind of dynamic and power relations relating to carbon emissions and production. So in other words, what we're going to see is in fact increased fossil fuel emissions and consumptions for mining, transport, manufacturing, construction, maintenance, and decommissioning as well. When I argue this, I'm not meaning I'm against these technologies. I'm just trying to put forward a view that we have to understand what are the implications, and that I believe that, in my view, that these are not a panacea for overall global reduction. Okay. Just here, kind of just broad kind of description here of kind of all the different technological revolutions, and we can understand, for example, the difference between the steam engine and having coal houses, coal stoves, and all these things during the early periods, moving over to modern electricity, where you're no longer required to have that coal burning in your house, and the differences these technologies were able to bring about. But one thing about all these different technological revolutions were that they all came with, allowed for expanded production and expanded accumulation of capital on a world scale. And therefore, I think we are more familiar with the kinds of emissions and kinds of pollution. And just to show the kind of dramatic change is, it has been that CO2 emissions have increased some 400% since, I think, the 1960s I have here. I can't see that number in full. But I think for me, this graph shows it all from the 1880s, just how with each new type of technological revolution did not really result in a decline or consumption or use of carbon intensive production. Rather, it increased reliance on kind of carbon intensive production. And I can't see how the current green technological revolution is going to change this path, which is spiraling in an upward, continuously upward trajectory. Now, the Montreal Protocol for me is a very important case study of kind of a global deal on a green economy. And I think it's here that this protocol, I think, is a very important one to be studied, to give us some kind of glimpse of what is likely to happen as we move forward in our demand for green economy and a just transition. I don't know how much time I have 10 minutes. Now, the Montreal Protocol was really a UNEP sponsored process, a protocol basically on substances that depleted the ozone layer. And so, of course, they brought all the parties together to agree to embark on a path of technological change and substance change in order to ensure that we preserve, or at least start the process of closing the ozone layer. Now, there were two kinds of industries which I looked at, or I thought a very interesting case study, which was electronics, and of course, automobile, which is the #1 polluter, or at least a huge polluter in carbon emissions. Now, it is true, and it's positive, that this kind of, I would say, climate enforcing kind of regulation was able to change the course of how production took place. But it's important how we then look at and examine what then actually transpired through this process. Firstly, we see that it took the private sector at least 9 years to change over the system from what they currently used. And this was example mostly of the automobile sector. The electronic sector was, of course, much more easier, and they changed all the way they made their chipboards and all those kinds of things using new kinds of substances, which was led by South Africa, I found out. So it took 9 years, even though CFCs do not require any radical or major technological advances, or in fact, any radical changes in workplace organization, which would have then required changes in, of course, the overall way factories were designed and all those kinds of planning systems that would have been a major headache for the private sector. And they only started kind of rolling out the new technologies from 1992 to 1995. So, but there was one implication, or major implication. The HFC 134, which is a substitute for the chemicals you use in your radiator of the vehicles. Although it was successful in reducing its depletion properties on the ozone layer, it had a massive effect in its contribution to global warming. In fact, they say that this new product or substitute is much more carbon polluting than the old kind of exhaust came out of the vehicles. So as we can see, with this major breakthrough in terms of the Montreal Protocol, it did not really take us out of a quagmire of global warming. In fact, it added to the problem of global warming as a new technological kind of advance within the system that has been developed then. What are the lessons for me? Okay, I think I have to wrap up soon, half an hour. So I think the key kind of take home that I take from this process was really the fact that it is possible to have a technology forcing regulation, but the way this protocol was implemented it was based primarily on a profit motive. So it was based on capital. It wasn't forced in a way that it had to do it in a year or 2 years. It was able to adjust, which is what capital always says: we need to adjust our time. There's a cost factor implication. There's a profit motive. We have investors. And so it becomes, of course, a big challenge to get the private sector to move over to a new kind of policy. I think what it also demonstrates is that you cannot have a system of changing to a new an alternative paradigm which seeks to save our planet to one that ensures that we should only orientate and pursue and force our states to change the policy on financing. And I think this is what is being asked of the state, is to reorientate its financing and give that and invest that in the green technologies, and to have green procurement, which is I think what we're having in South Africa right now, or at least the battles around this green procurement that's taking place. And that is completely insufficient if we want to have a fundamental change. And if we look at another example of history, I would say that the Montreal Protocol pales into significance if we're looking at technological forcing regulation, which happened during wartime in the 1940s. And so I'm going to end up with this kind of example. I'm sure many of us are familiar with this, but I think it's a very important one. Enterprises were given 1 month notice to convert the industry into a wartime industry. I mean, that's that's what I think we really need some kind of consensus, because we are, of course, running out of time. And they were forced to develop completely new sets of goods, commodities, and new sets of technologies, around which you had a reorganization of the labor process and full employment. And the key lesson here for me was that what you had here was really a planned system, even though the motives, of course, was to the detriment of working people and people around the globe. Of course, we don't support war. And so what we see here was then a dramatic change that occurred. What I can see currently is we're not having a dramatic change. Is a slow process, which is mediated by the state and capital, and somehow through this process they're going to come to some kind of consensus, or some kind of war, which I think has taken place in the country, war between different sections of capital and war with the state. What strategy for labor? I think labor should develop its own alternative. And not be trapped within a framework of climate change, which I think is completely unsustainable. I think it's a path that leaves us really where I think the Montreal Protocol was, that it was set on the terms of private capital, and I think the current paradigm leaves us open to that, and I don't think it's a pathway that will ensure a sustainable for all of us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Cottle, for that very insightful presentation. And I want to now open it up to see if there are any questions coming from the floor. Anybody want to come in? Janet, over to you.
Sorry, could I interrupt you just before you start and maybe ask Eddie to take your PowerPoint now, or stop sharing your screen so that we can see you.
Oh. Right. Just close it. Is that fine?
Yes, that's perfect. Thanks.
Okay.
Over to you, Janet.
Yes, hi. Thanks, Eddie. I thought that was really interesting. I wanted to ask you just to clarify something about the extractivism and the minerals used in the production of renewable energy components, and that whole debate about whether that is in itself problematic. I don't know what the evidence is that actually is going to lead to an increase in fossil fuel or carbon emissions, that the extractive process itself. So isn't there I don't know the answer to this, but isn't there a process whereby you extract certain minerals? The extraction itself is not the problem, and if you extract them using green hydrogen vehicles, for example, instead of fossil fuel vehicles, what is the problem with that? isn't there a point at which you've extracted enough and replaced the technology, the machinery required for the extraction with alternative technology, which in itself is not producing carbon emissions? So I don't understand exactly why you say that the production itself of green technology is going to lead to increased fossil fuel usage. And then the other thing was about the state's role and the war economy. And just to say, about 10 years ago, I read a really interesting book by some sort of radical Australians, which was called Climate Code Red, and they were actually arguing for a war economy to be implemented to basically force a conversion from fossil fuel before it was too late. And they argued very convincingly that that was possible and was what was required in terms of forcing states on a global level to implement this transition, and basically to not to bypass capital, but it's basically to say you need some kind of state-driven process to make this happen. So I don't know what you think about that. Thanks.
Dr. Cottle, do you want to take one by one? You're welcome to if you'd like.
Okay, sure. No, I think when I presented, I said I don't have a problem with the extractivism per se of having a windmill, having a solar panel. But what I'm raising is that if we believe that this will solve the carbon emission problem, I think that's where I'm saying that is where the problem, because it is the windmill and the solar panel is another commodity like another commodity. It's produced on the world market for exchange and to be used for all sorts of purposes, whether it's for energy or for the home or for anything else. And if we look at all kinds of commodities, now we take the windmill and all the metals and things required, or the solar panel, and we look at a car vehicle or a microwave, etc., right? They all need similar kinds of materials, common, produced unlimitedly for the world market, because you are having this as kind of normative capital accumulation. So I don't see a difference between what is a policy on green technologies and expanding capital accumulation on a world scale. It is different if you're producing, and this is where I agree with you, to say, well, we can produce windmills. We think it's better to roll out solar panels on working class homes. I think that's fantastic, but within a planned framework system, which I think your Australian friends are arguing about the semblance of a war economy. So you must use and you must have an extractive industry. I'm not arguing against the extractive industry. I can't see how we run away from coal, for example. But it is the way these commodities are then being used, either for, which I think will then, if we use it as if it becomes a form of status quo on the world market as commodities, and once this the commodities go, remember we're going to have in the next 5 years a more efficient windmill. Then we're going to have a more efficient solar panel, like our phones and laptops already. We can see it every year. You have a new model, like a vehicle, a car. It's going to be, it will have the same laws will apply of capital to alternative technologies than what we already have. It won't have its own law of supply and demand. It will have the same contradictions as other policies and other commodities. And that is what I'm saying in this paper. Unless you subject it to a what do you call it, a war economy on ecology, for lack of a better description. And then you can manage how you then extract, and then you can manage your carbon emissions within a planned kind of system. So I think that's basically what I'm arguing. I'm not arguing against extractivism. or the use of these technologies.
See that Janet's trying to speak, but into a muted microphone.
Oh, sorry, I was saying, is that a decommodification argument? You keep talking about commodities. Commodities are just things that are sold in the market. So
Yes.
you're saying we must decommodify this whole process?
Correct.
Which means essentially having a state socialist economy.
Well, and you can decommodify. There's a way in which, for example, you can restrict, for example, the rapid growth of private healthcare or public healthcare vis-a-vis the two. I'm not calling, well, there is, of course, a way to engage through this process, but in the final analysis, I can't see even a social democratic South Africa resolving this problem. If we just take, for example, the scandal in 2015 from the leading green economy in the world, which is Germany, Volkswagen was found to have bypassed a mile the regulations and agreement on the technologies and carbon emissions for their vehicles. And, you know, Volkswagen is the leading producer in the world, belonging to the most green economy in the world. And that tells you a lot, and it must raise a question then of what exactly is transpiring and why is this thing still happening in this recent period and within the framework of a country that espouses the most green world. And I think this demonstrates to me the problem of the limits of the market and allowing the market to then pursue its technological advancement without a kind of really strong and rigid imposition, I think, from the state. I can't see in any social system that we're going to get away from the contradiction of increasing carbon emissions.
Thanks.
All right, next up on the stack is Gary and then Buntu. So Gary, do you want to go first?
Yeah, thanks. Eddie, thanks very much for that input. I've just posted 2 links in the chat to articles, and just to sort of follow up from Janet, where I agree with you is in terms of the basic economic model behind the industries, the energy industries, is that it still perpetuates a view around unrestricted growth, and that we haven't turned that corner yet in understanding that we are a planet with finite boundaries. There are some renewable components to that, but there's finite boundaries, and this idea of growth, unlimited growth, is one of the key problems that we face, and that the Western sort of economic model in terms of capitalism has driven a great amount of that. Where I disagree with you, and the articles show that, is that the use of renewables does reduce carbon emissions. I mean, that's now very clearly demonstrated. You know, and as you add more turbines into the process, so what you're doing is that you're reducing your reliance on fossil fuels. So it's not an immediate shift change, but it is a gradual shift change over a period of time. And the thing on the rare earth stuff is, I mean, it's often used by the fossil fuel industry as a critique of renewables. But what you have to look at is you have to look at the ground mass that you are moving for coal versus the ground mass that you're moving for the nickel and cobalt and other stuff. And it's very clear that what renewable energy in terms of extractive uses is far less than what you using extractive in terms of coal and etc. And that industry is now becoming very good at recycling because they've understood that, you know. So the problem for us is that the technological change is happening very fast. So what was relevant in 2010 isn't relevant in 2022. There's been significant changes around that, you know. And you use the example of VW. That crisis, that issue in VW is a massive crisis, you know. And they fired those people, and they've made substantive changes. It's also in part what's driving their transition to electric vehicles. So they're backing electric vehicles. Toyota, on the other hand, is backing hydrogen-powered vehicles. So both of those transitions are going to change the world fundamentally in terms of technology, and with that will come changes in capital relations and how things work. And I think the challenge, from a labor perspective is how does labor locate itself within that? In South Africa, in 2010, it was a very different position to what it is now in 2022, where it was very open to renewable technology in 2010. It's now very, very opposed to it and very supportive of the coal industry, which is understandable because there's a higher amount of concentrated jobs in the coal industry than in the renewable industry. And so for a union, that's a very that's where your organizing base lies. So the transition from coal to renewables is a fundamental crisis for the particularly the sort of mining union movement. But I'm not the transition from coal to renewables, I don't see that there's an alternative, that you can't keep producing coal and coal plants. So I'm interested in that, where we go from your view. I mean, where does the world go? And yeah, let me leave it at that.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks so much for that. Look, I think there's different institutes making different calculations on these questions right now, and I think there's no consensus. There is a contestation on these issues now. When the claim here, when I'm assessing what you have within the global system, and this is it, is we have the moving around of where the pollution and where the most pollution is taking place. And yes, some countries can say, well, we moved over to this type of technology, and therefore now you can see we have lower carbon emissions. Right? At the same time, you're having increasing carbon emissions elsewhere. The second issue is that even if you mine nickel, right, you're going to need an energy source for that to mine it, and you're going to need an energy source to burn it. Right? A windmill can't burn it, example. Right? So you're still relying on high intensive smelting systems to be able to smelt those kinds of metals. Doesn't matter what they are, those kinds of minerals and things, and those are reliant either currently on coal or some other kind of major power-driven energy system, in fact also whatever nuclear. So we're not out of that. We can't separate those productions and make a singular calculation outside of all those kinds of things. But for example, let's say, okay, fine, there is lower, it does overall lower the emissions. Let's take that for granted. All right. What I'm arguing is it's still going to be subject to the law of supply and demand. Right? And the law of supply and demand will ensure that there will be expanded production and consumption of these commodities. Each of those commodities will have a high turnover, what is called rapid obsolescence. And that is often what climate activists don't deal with, is this problem of rapid obsolescence of technology. Just how quickly technologies become obsolete. And so you're going to have this waste that is being created all the time. In the same way we have a lot of waste on just laptops or cell phones, the law will still apply to these new commodities that now will be rolled out into the economies where we find them. We will not be able to prevent them from sharing those contradictions as other commodities have, even though we preside in them a new role of lowering carbon emissions. They will still be involved in absolute waste that will around the globe. And that's what I'm saying. Yes, I agree with you that I'm not arguing against technologies. I don't think how can one argue against the technologies, right? Do we think it's more efficient? We can maybe do certain things. But the point is, as I've argued and tried to show, that every great advance in technological efficiency has resulted in an expanded production and expanded consumption of those commodities. And that, I think, is what Jevron's paradox teaches me, or tries to give a frame to how we understand what's possible or what is likely to happen as these new technologies get rolled out I mean, I would be happy if tomorrow we don't have any coal production in South Africa or these kinds of things, but it will still, someone else is going to have to produce those carbon emissions. Someone else is going to have to dig. Else is going to have to do the dirty work. And we can, and that's why I think we need a system that will allow to manage that kind of different types of work, and we at least pay attention to the 1972 book and what it teaches us about limiting this, in fact, even limiting how much of this technology we're going to roll out in the next 10 years, combined with other technologies and other commodities, which we haven't stopped the production. We haven't stopped the mass production of cars. Right? It's a precondition, or it's a condition, part of the condition to rolling out these other technologies side by side, or something like that. But just having this free market system of these things, we're not going to move over to a lower. My view still remains we're not going to move over to a new system of lower carbon environments.
Alex, can I just respond? Do you mind?
Sure, and then we'll move over to Ubuntu. Yeah.
Yeah, so Eddie, I mean, I think your position was correct in terms of, if we take smelting as an example, 15 years ago, it was driven by coal or gas. Those were the sort of intense heat energy components required for the high energy that's needed to smelt metals. But that's no longer the case. It is now technologically capable. You do it through electricity. So it's really around about, the question is can you have a constant supply of electricity? That's the technological challenge. And that's the issue about renewables, not the intensity of the heat, because you now can heat electric forges, basically, so so you can get the intensity, so you can actually deal with the metal issue. The interesting thing that, and I don't know if you've seen the PCC's recent report on energy, and in terms of its consultation with the various stakeholders, so the Presidential Climate Commission, and they are sort of tasked with managing this just transition aspect. I'd be interested if you could at some point just talk about how you see the PCC dealing with that. And their paper, I think the most recent paper is a fairly informative one in terms of where they try and give input into the integrated resource plan. But in terms of the technology, we are clearly in a place where we can smelt by electricity. The question, but your original point, I think, still stands, is that the technological advance hasn't reduced the consumption. What it's done is it's enabled more consumption. And that problem still stands. But in terms of renewables advancing fossil fuels, I think that's now a settled debate, really, to a large extent. Thanks very much.
Okay, no, cool. Listen, I mean, look, you still have to have the sources to provide that electricity. I'm aware that you can produce. So, I mean, currently people would use coal energy, to produce that electricity to kind of burn. But I haven't really kept tabs with the evolution now of how much of that can be smelted with a kind of a new technology. But I think one will have to kind of review and now, of course, look at that and see what's the future of that, those studies and so on. Unfortunately, I haven't looked at the new paper. I've been kind of off some of these issues. So sorry, I won't be able to respond to that comment or that request for now. Yeah.
Awesome. Thanks, Eddie.
Thanks. That's helpful. Maybe I could just add to Gary's list there. I think the point is that the critique of the neoliberal growth model is definitely valid, but the data on renewables and the technology has shifted significantly. I added a little study there showing that this year seems to be likely the year that renewables are displacing fossil fuels in electricity generation to the point where they're entering a long-term structural decline. So I think there has been some really big shifts there that are worth paying attention to in thinking about how renewables are displacing fossil fuels. But I will pass to Ubuntu to add a question here, and then I see Alberika. Maybe for the sake of time, we can take two questions So Buntu, do you want to ask yours? And then Alberika, I'm not sure I'm saying your name right, but hopefully you can come in next. Thanks.
Thanks, Alex. And thanks, Eddie, for your very insightful paper. I want to focus on the question of the ownership of green energy production and green energy supplies in the South African context. And I'd like you, Eddie, to, if it's possible, if you see a relationship and a sequential flow between the state within the context of trying to determine this ownership of green energy production and supplies, between the state, the legislative framework which enables the creation of the market for the green energy production supplies. Because even now, you see in South Africa, even in tabloids, where you have a proliferation of adverts for lower income communities on solar panels, and the financial sector entering that market, which has been enabled by the legislative framework which has been created, spearheaded by the state. That sequential flow, the creation of markets, ownership of these production supplies, and capital accumulation. And finally, and I think what has not really been touched on, has not really been discussed, the implications of green production energy supplies on land use. Much of land use to these, green production energy supplies really take up: wind turbines, solar panels, and what implications do these have on land use? And thank you.
Okay. Yeah. Look, I would really like to see those reports that were mentioned. I'm a skeptic on this. I've not really seen it becoming headlines that our carbon emissions have now been reduced, because if you have a structural shift into renewables, then we would start to see those kinds of declines. And I think by now, of course, everyone would then, of course, I think should have consensus around that. So yeah, I'd like to see and read those reports, and of course, I'm open to my understanding of those changes and so on. Look, I think the purpose of my paper have been, of course, been very focused on really trying to focus on understand the paradox of technological change, and that how this paradox applies to every technological revolution that capitalism has undergone thus far. And I've argued that paradox will be persistent throughout the life of capitalism. Now, I think and thanks for that question, I think we must also be clear also the fact that these drives of technological change, the nature of how they're being driven, the nature of the pressures of how they're being foisted on national states and national entities, is not without the desire of capital accumulation, because there is not a contradiction, as I was trying to argue, between more efficient, greener technologies and capital accumulation. And part, I think, of this is, of course, there's no kind of, I think, mistake. It's just how the Reiter was really pursuing the Germans and so on while he was there. And he, of course, has his own agenda and his own cronies around him to kind of play his agenda out, or that kind of faction to play out the factional. So to come to the state, I think the ownership questions have been a long battle. It's been a 30-year struggle around this question, essentially between labor, capital, and the state. And I think labor has essentially lost this battle around ensuring that that the nature of energy production is in the form of some kind of form still being held in the common good, and that should be centralized within the state. I'm not familiar with the kinds of legal frameworks and regulations allowing for all this to take place, but it was not without a big battle. Then it was a 30-year battle. And it seems as if private capital is getting the foothold more strongly on this question. There have been many analysis, and I think people who've argued already, I think in the 1990s, before 2002, the World Summit of Sustainable Development in South Africa, that under Thabo Mbeki, that he was already pursuing and facilitating the breakdown of the state to pursue some of this kinds of agenda of the ownership question. So what I'm arguing is that, of course, there is a role for the private sector, but if we leave the core of that to the private sector, we will have that framing of the system which allows for its unlimited consumption. And I think that is the big central issue that I have here. But it's correct that there are large-scale social problems. And I think one of the issues here at the Center for Inequality is that is exactly the study that is being pursued at the moment, which is by our colleagues here, not myself, my other colleagues here, is what is the nature of the kinds of social inequalities that this new system is going to generate. And one of them, of course, is the current land use competition that has been existent in our country, and also kind of, I think, there's a recent paper, which I've not yet read, on the engendered types of inequality that is likely to be generated by the new technological advances. So I believe actually there's a good dialogue that we're having, and we should kind of pursue these discussions, and I'm really open to receiving these documents. Sorry, Buntu, I don't think I could also hear this case answer your question fully. Sorry about that.
All right, thanks very much for that. We've got 2 minutes left, so maybe we can squeeze in a last question here from Alborika. And feel free to correct my pronunciation of your name.
I know that's fine. Thank you. Thank you for the presentation, Edward. Very interesting stuff. So my name is Alborika from the Center for Sustainability Transitions. I do hear your logic in terms of saying we're going to be migrating from one type of technology to another. It's still going to drive a lot of consumption and production, and this could still lead to global warming and those types of things. I'm just wondering, I think that there definitely is the intention that is quite visible in sustainability, that we want to do better as a society, and we want economies that are more inclusive and green and more responsible. So what are your practical tools or advice for how we can approach this differently before we actually fall into that pattern of high consumption? Like, is it stuff like diversification, or what other practical things could be put in place now while it's still in the early stages? And then just quickly, the second one, I didn't hear your final point that you made in your presentation on labor creating its own framework, I think you said, or if that is not the current JET framework that's there now, or if it is that one. I didn't catch that quite properly. Could you maybe elaborate a bit more on that? Thank you so much.
Okay, thanks so much for that question. Very important. Look, I think that, let's take for example, all governments are engaged in trade agreements, and one of the kinds of prevailing, I think, tension in this current period is the fact that how the West wants to foist its paradigm and its models on the South once again, right? And this is, I think, part of my presentation as well, when I raised the fact that there should be, we should start fighting for a model that suits our conditions and at our own pace. And we need to negotiate and mediate what is required for us in this, because because what we're currently talking about here, and I think the main conversation is about growth. which is the mainstream of the capitalist economy. And part of this paper is really trying to argue two things: growth in the south and degrowth in the north. But that is, of course, a gigantic political and economic and social. And as you can see, if we could not get up until today, how do we think we can have a green trade or green future modeled? Secondly, what I'm trying to critically is the fact that just foisters on the south, creating new financial structures, etc., etc. And part of this is to get themselves out of their own lack of growth in the north, stagnating recessions and so on. So part of this whole shift is also, or in fact, is fundamentally about allowing the system of capital accumulation to enter a new path or a long wave of capitalist growth. Because we've now, since 2002, 2005, gone through a long wave of contraction. And there's the struggle of how to get out of this pathway, and part of that, green technology is part of that pathway, to move to a long pathway of capitalist expansion. And that and if we include that within our perspective, we can see some of the positives in this what is being heralded, and of course some of the, I think, bigger negatives, which I see and try to alert people to in this paper. So there has to be a way in which the countries in the South are able to mediate this scenario and engage critically with green technologies, and not to allow themselves to be absorbed into what will be another mega debt structural adjustment program, possibly, if it's allowed. Because remember, rolling out of energy sources, of course, allows a lot of money, and partly to Eskom's problem was, of course, it is because it was the problems of mega project development results in the kinds of catastrophes that we see occurring. It's kind of very predictable kind of pathways of development. So unfortunately, I don't have any more, I think, concrete stuff around that. I think that will come out in the near futures when we see BRICS is going to meet, this is going to meet, all these trade blocs are busy getting together to iron out what they want to pursue and who they're going to penalize and who they're going to disagree with. Coming to labor, I do understand that labor has been working on, there's some documents that are going to come out in the near future around concretizing some of their perspectives, and I think my colleagues are working on that here at the Inequality Center. They've been working before my arrival here with COSATU around these questions. So I would be interested to see what they have come up with in a more concrete fashion. But what I'm arguing is that that labor should not be subsumed by the dominant paradigm. It should step out of that paradigm and critically lead a pathway for the future, because we know that macroeconomic policies are really policies that normally are pressurized by the labor movements. They are the biggest social movements globally, and they are the movements that have historically been able to deal with social inequality, poverty, injustice, and so on. But what I've argued is that if you look at I have a paper, so I will send the paper to everyone as a link to maybe read and pursue, is to look at each of the elements of the justice transition and work out, rather than having consensus, rather work out a alternative pathway. For one, it must look at maintaining this pathway within the state, not relying on the IMF, World Bank, and so on, but for example, look at new financial mechanisms to allow for rollout of alternative technologies, but under a huge role for civil society to democratize that process. If I have my presentation, I can maybe go through more detail, but the summary
Eddie, we're going to have to stop you, I'm afraid.
Okay.
We're seriously out of time.
Yeah.
So I think, Alex, sorry, I mean, we're going to have to continue this conversation most certainly over YouTube. Alex, would you like to finish off?
Yeah. No worries. Sorry, I was trying to gently wave at you in the background around time, but thank you very much for this discussion. And maybe to also encourage that COSATU does have its Just Transition Blueprint out, which lays out some of that thinking worth engaging in. But thank you everybody for this robust discussion and the exchange of viewpoints around, the role that renewables can and cannot play situated within a neoliberal framework. And thank you very much, Dr. Cottle, for this presentation, which I think sparked some really rich discussion. So many thanks, and we will have another seminar soon. Andrea probably can give us more details about that. Thank you.
Okay, great. Eddie, thanks so much. It was really very, very rich presentation, and I see that in the chats there has been a whole lot of additional kind of parallel exchanges.
Yeah.
I'll copy the chat into the YouTube video, into the comment section. So if anyone wants to go on there, or if you want to put the link to your paper in that comment section, you can do that too. Okay, so thanks very much for generating again a talk that could go on forever. And yes, we'll be having not next week, but the week after, we will have a second version of the seminar. I don't want to announce what it is, because just in case it doesn't happen. But yes, so yes, surprise for you in 2 weeks' time. Let's leave it at that. Okay, thanks so much, Eddie.
Okay, no, thank you so much for the invitation. I really enjoyed it, and I enjoyed some of the challenges and controversies around the exchange. I still think there's a lot to clarify in the process.
Yes.
I think for me, listening to the conversation, I think is a great improvement of what the kind of discourse was, I think, 5 years ago. And yeah, I think that this was a very rich engagement, and thanks so much for the invitation. And I look forward to reading those readings as you suggested as well.
Awesome.
Thanks so much.
Great. Yes, they'll all be on the comments on YouTube. So if anyone wants to go there, that's where you go. Okay, have a great weekend, everybody. And yeah,
thanks.